opportunity is what blacks have always most needed. Opportunity, equal treatment, not special treatment. We started out by talking about those women in Hidden Figures, the movie and the book. No one lowered any standards to hire those women. They had to meet the current standards, and they did. They met them. What they needed was the opportunity.
We are privileged to have with us today Jason Riley. His book, The Affirmative Action Myth, Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed, is a book that I think I would highly recommend that you read, especially if you're trying to make sense out of racial preferences and the issue of affirmative action, DEI, even reparations. We'll get into all of that because it's all part of that book. Came out a couple of months ago. We have information about it on our website. You can get it in hardback or Kindle. I suspect you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, so we'll look there first. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to find it. Jason Riley is an individual we quote from some time to time. I was just noticing, and I clicked on the search engine there. I think we have at least a half a dozen articles or columns where either we're posting his article or we're quoting from him recently. And he is the senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He also is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Author of a couple of books, but the one that we're talking about today is Affirmative Action. But I might also point you to the one called Maverick, which is a biography of Thomas Sowell. So, Jason Riley, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
Let's, if we can, get into the history. But before we do, I love the fact that you opened by talking about this movie that I quote from time to time, Hidden Figures, which is the story of a number of African-American women that worked at NASA, because in some respects it is a reminder of how gifted they were, especially in figures and developing computer technology in its formative years, but also a reminder of some of the segregation and the colored bathrooms and the rest. And you use that to kind of remind us that the subtitle of your book is Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed.
Yes. And the reason I start with the story of Hidden Figures, which was a popular movie about 10 years ago, it came out, but it was based on a book of the same name, written by a woman named Margot Shetterly, whose father also worked at NASA, was a scientist at NASA, a black scientist at NASA. And what strikes me about the movie and the book is what it says about black history, beyond its immediate subject matter, which is the women you mentioned, these black female scientists who were hired in the 1940s and 50s. They were all college graduates, very talented. Some of them were second-generation college graduates from leading universities. And what it tells me is two things. One, there was a black middle class in place before affirmative action. And B, it was growing at a pretty rapid clip, far more rapidly than it would be growing during the era of affirmative action, which I date to the late 60s and early 70s. These women showed what blacks were doing. The communities they came from showed what blacks were capable of. Business owners, architects, doctors, safe, neat black neighborhoods. All this was going on despite the fact that segregation was also going on.
Right.
Legal segregation, government-sponsored
Yes.
segregation. This is what blacks were able to accomplish. And I think it's an important point to make because people look at black-white gaps today, or high unemployment rates, or high dropout rates from school and so forth, and they want to blame racism. And I say, well, wait a minute. Racism isn't anything new, and if anything, there's less of it today than there used to be. So something else must be explaining what's going on today. We can't chalk it all up to racism because you can point to these women who were able to overcome far greater odds than blacks today.
Great story. By the way, again, you also, of course, document the fact that the black poverty rate dropped almost in half because from the 1940s to the 1960s, and this is before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so you're saying there's something else, and that's the first chapter. Ain't Misbehaving, the Politics of Responsibility. And it does seem to me that if you had an intact home, a father and a mother, if you had discipline, some of the issues that are maybe still out on the streets today wouldn't be taking place. And so, in some respects, you take some of that back in your first chapter to this issue of personal responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the focus in the first half of the 20th century. That's what blacks were focused on. You saw more intact families. You saw more two-parent homes. And I think that's why you saw the upward mobility that you just described. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. No affirmative action program has ever replicated that result, come close to replicating that result. No government welfare program, no Great Society program has ever come close to doing what blacks did on their own before these policies existed, before the Great Society, before affirmative action, before a black president, before blacks had any kind of real political clout in this country in terms of mayors running big cities with large black populations, or black governors or senators or what have you. This was all done in an era where there were tremendous odds that blacks had to overcome, and yet they were able to do that. And I think one of the reasons was an intact family. As recently as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father.
Yeah.
Today, more than 3 in 4 are not. That's a huge problem. It's a huge issue. Even in terms of household income, it makes a big difference. So, for instance, in the first half of the 20th century, you saw black earnings as a percentage of white earnings growing all through the 40s, all through the 50s, and into the 60s. That trend starts to slow down and stall in the 1970s. And one of the reasons why is that you saw a proliferation of single-parent homes in the black community starting in the late 60s and early 70s. And, just that having 2 incomes versus 1 income is obviously going to make a huge difference in a family. And so, yes, I think a lot of this can be traced to the breakdown of the black family that we saw occurring beginning in the late 60s. And even affirmative action, even racial preferences have not been able to overcome that breakdown of the black family.
Interesting statistic. But Jason, if we can, we probably need to give a little bit of history of affirmative action. But it is interesting that as we get to that chapter on equal treatment to equal results, you quote from a New York Times piece in which they were asking a very racially and socioeconomically diverse group of 12 students if they supported affirmative action. Just one person said yes. So they already were beginning to understand that that was not necessarily helpful. But affirmative action was implemented as a policy to help African Americans, and it obviously hurt them. But can you give us some of the background, take us back to 1964 and 65? Because in some respects, the idea is that this is something is going to help advance a group of individuals that had been persecuted because of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow. Can you speak to that?
Sure, and that's an important point because the term affirmative action does mean different things to different people. And originally, affirmative action was about outreach, pure and simple. We're going to offer opportunities to groups that historically have been overlooked, whether in the workplace or on college campuses. That was the idea, to outreach to these overlooked groups and helping to bring them up to current standards, to be hired, to matriculate on a college campus, and so forth. What it became, however, in practice was lowering standards to get a certain racial mix on campus. It turned into quotas and set-asides. That's what it became in practice. That's what it is today. That's what the Supreme Court overturned. And there are still people out there who pretend it still only means the former definition. And so you do have to nail down. And it's interesting that when you look at surveys and look at the wording of the question on affirmative action, the more specific the question is about what affirmative action is in reality, that is racial preferences, the worse it polls. And the poll you cite of those students is a good example of that. But it's nothing new. In other words, that first definition of affirmative action, outreach, has long been popular with huge swaths of the American public going all the way back to the 1960s. That is not something people mostly opposed. They supported it. It had broad public support. What has also had overwhelmingly negative response to are quotas and set-asides and racial preferences. And that's, again, whether you're asking black people or white people, no one, that has never been popular. Racial preferences has never been popular. And in fact, the polls taken after the Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago showed something like 70% of the public agreed with the Supreme Court decision, including a majority of blacks, a majority of whites, a majority of Hispanics, and a majority of Asians. So there's a small group of elites, academics, activists, and politicians that love these racial preference policies. But they've never been popular with the general public, not 50 years ago and not today.
You know, and I was thinking, too, since I'm one of the old guys around the table, I lived through some of that, and I remember what would be called the Bakke decision, 1978. That was a Supreme Court decision, had to do with UC Davis, University of California, Davis, and one in which you had a ruling that even at that time, and that goes back a long ways if you think about this, there were supposed to not be using race as the sole and defining factor in admissions. So I think it makes your point that in many cases there was already resistance to that in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Now we find ourselves in the 2020s when we finally have a decision. But it wasn't like this is something that just sprung up under the Trump administration, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, colorblindness, and that's really what we're talking about here. Colorblindness was the central driving purpose of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. That's what Martin Luther King was all about. That's what Thurgood Marshall was about, judging people without regard to race, not due to race. Not the government not picking favorites based on race, not picking winners and losers based on race, but a colorblind approach, a universal standard that applied to all groups of all backgrounds and ethnicities and so forth. Today's civil rights leadership has flipped that on its head. It's all about racial preferences. And the word colorblind has become a dirty word.
Yes.
Politically, on the political left. They're not for colorblindness. When you're for colorblindness, you don't name your organization Black Lives Matter and then get upset when people say all lives matter. You don't support racial preferences in hiring and admissions. You don't support racially gerrymandered voting districts. The left today is all about race consciousness. DEI is all about race consciousness, and that is the complete opposite of what the civil rights movement was about. And I think the civil rights movement was so successful, the reason we got the Brown ruling and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act is because King and those guys appealed to universal principles of fairness. And they got a lot of non-blacks to come along with them in supporting those goals. Today, the leadership is pushing, again, for race-specific proposals, and they're just not popular. People like colorblindness.
Let me, if I can, just before we take a break, maybe have you talk for just a minute about critical theory and critical race theory, because Chapter 3 gets into Derek Bell and all the ideas of critical theory, because in some respects that has even changed affirmative action even more so, because the argument is that if you are a victim, you don't even have to give a justification for why you need preferences. And if you're identified as an oppressor, you don't have a right to speak to that issue. And so that's been something that has even changed the view of affirmative action more significantly, hasn't it?
It has. This critical race theory used to be something that was sort of relegated to college campuses and college seminars, and now it's sort of crawled off of campus and is infecting our workplace diversity training programs and even our K through 12 curriculum in the form of the 1619 Project. And it's unfortunate. It's extremely unfortunate because we are an increasingly diverse society in terms of racially and ethnicity and so forth, and only becoming more so. And the idea that you have the critical race theorists out there who want a sort of racial grievance industry in this country is sad. It makes absolutely no sense. It's very divisive. And as I was saying, based on the polls and surveys, Americans don't like it. But yet, again, you have a group of elites that continue to push this. And they are elites. Those are the people who support affirmative action, because to the extent that it's been beneficial for anyone, it has helped elites. It has helped, namely, blacks who were already better off to begin with. So even though these policies are sold in the name of helping the black poor or the underprivileged, it is mostly middle-class blacks who benefit from these policies. And the critical race theorists that was dreamed up again by middle-class blacks and people like Derek Bell. And he was pretty honest about why he wanted critical race theory. It was basically an affirmative action program. He wanted race and ethnicity used as a hiring credential on campuses for professors, and that's what it's become. That's what it's out there doing. It's a way of it's a fancy justification for affirmative action. That's all it is. But again, it is not broadly popular in the U.S., and I believe it's becoming unpopular by the day.
I think so. And part of that, it may just be because, first of all, counting by race is harder because we have more interracial marriages. You, of course, as you pointed out just a minute ago, you have a lot less racism, either overt or even inherent, and those are issues.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode.
But Jason, I thought it might be good to talk about reparations because you talk about Elizabeth Warren and maybe some people like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker talking about that. But you also remind us that back when he ran for president, Barack Obama, as well as Hillary Clinton and others, were not interested in reparations because that was oftentimes seen as sort of a fringe issue. So this whole reparations discussion has been going on for some time, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed, but help us understand where it is right now and whether or not we'll ever see reparations paid to those individuals who are the ancestors of slaves.
Well, I don't think we're going to see reparations paid to anyone, and I just don't think it's something the majority of Americans will ever go for, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense. All the slaves are gone, all the slave owners are gone, and so you're really asking the descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. In fact, it's worse than that because most white Americans trace their ancestry to people who came here after the Civil War. So you're really asking people who aren't even descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to people who were never slaves. I mean, it makes no sense. It really reaches that level of absurdity. It's also, when you think about it, all reparations is another huge wealth redistribution scheme. And, we've tried this before. If simply sending out government checks to people solved poverty or reduced inequality, we would have solved this a long time ago. We're good at doing it. We've had trillions of dollars have gone into wealth redistribution schemes since the 1960s. That's what the whole Great Society was about under Lyndon Baines Johnson. It doesn't work. So not only do I think it's unpopular outside of certain quarters on the left, I just don't think it would work. I don't think it would address the problems that people think it would address. There's another point to be made here. One of the justifications for reparations that has become more popular is the one made by Ta-Nehisi Coates and some others, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, and that is redlining. They bring up redlining.
Yes.
And this was when it was difficult in the 30s and 40s for blacks to secure loans for mortgages, and they were discriminated against. And there were these zones that the banks, if you lived within the zone, the bank wouldn't lend you money. or it was very, very difficult to get a loan. Well, one of the problems with basing reparations on redlining is that while a disproportionate number of blacks lived in these redlined zones, more whites than blacks lived in redlined areas overall. So if you're paying reparations based on who was redlined, you'd have to pay a lot of reparations to white people. So I just think this is a nonsensical scheme that it's gained currency on the left to the extent that progressivism has gained currency on the left, and this is one of those zany proposals that that progressives go for. But I don't even think mainstream Democrats would support this in the end.
I don't think so either. Again, the book is entitled The Affirmative Action Myth. Let's go to the phones. In Georgia, Benjamin, thank you for calling today.
Hello, how you doing today, gentlemen?
What would you like to share with us?
Right, I'm a long-time listener. I really appreciate everything that y'all do. I'm Shan. I'm a U.S. military veteran, retired, 26 years of service from the end of the Cold War up until about 10 years ago when I retired. And the Army is a great model of action without that affirmative action. The only affirmation you got was work hard, and you can go ahead and move up. All that minorities needed post-World War II and 48 during desegregation of the military was just that, desegregation. I've worked in many positions and jobs throughout the 26 years I was in. I was also an Army brat, so it's been my whole life, and it's amazing where I've seen the military go from in the late 80s, especially in my job career. I was a airborne infantryman. But the thing is, I think that when people are given an opportunity to excel, as we see with some of the early generals that we had in the Air Force and in the Army, in the 50s and 60s, I think all these men and women needed was an opportunity. Unfortunately, the world has gone where the Army doesn't influence American culture, but American culture is influencing the Army.
Yes.
And the backpedaling of some of the things that the Department of Defense is trying to change with Secretary Hegseth are some good things. It'd be nice to see the guys keep beards, which was something that was stopped after World War I because of gas masks. But a lot of things could be better discipline and structure.
Okay, Benjamin, let me just give Jason a chance to react because you've got some great points there. One of those is there's a place where you believe in a meritocracy. It doesn't matter what your race is. As a matter of fact, it should be irrelevant, and that seems to be where we're moving, Jason Riley.
Yes, that's certainly the direction that this administration seems to want to move in, and I would applaud that. And I agree with the caller entirely that opportunity is what blacks have always most needed. Opportunity, equal treatment, not special treatment. We started out by talking about those women in Hidden Figures, the movie and the book. No one lowered any standards to hire those women. They had to meet the current standards, and they did. They met them. What they needed was the opportunity. And when FDR signed an executive order saying that there was not going to be any more racial discrimination in hiring in the defense industry, they were given the opportunity to work in places like NASA, and they took advantage of it. And that is what blacks have excelled at doing when they have been given the opportunity, and that is what they did well before affirmative action, is seize opportunities, whether it was opportunities to get a better education, opportunities to get higher pay. And if you look at the trends, it really is remarkable. The trends in home ownership rates, the trends in years of education, the trends in entering middle-class professions, the trends in income. All of these things, blacks weren't just making absolute gains. They were gaining on whites. The gaps were closing. They were narrowing. All of those things start to slow, and in some cases even reverse course, starting in the late 60s and particularly in the early 70s, around the advent of affirmative action policies, racial preferences. Those trends start to slow. So I argue that these policies have not only been ineffective, I think they've largely been harmful in terms of slowing pre-existing growth trends and positive trends in the black community.
And 2 weeks ago, you wrote a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal, Racial Gerrymandering is a Bad Idea Whose Time Has Come. And that really gets us back to the Civil Rights Act and a remedy that I think the Supreme Court is going to hand down. Your thoughts?
Yes, it's a fascinating topic, and because what it illustrates is that the political left won't admit it's not still 1964 in this country, because it's bad for them politically to make such an admission. And so we get these efforts to put in place policies, or in the case of the Voting Rights Act, keep in place certain policies that pretend it's still the early 1960s. Their problem is that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a phenomenally successful piece of legislation. In the Deep South, you had states like Georgia, Mississippi, with black voter registration in the single digits.
Right.
By 1966, a year after the Voting Rights Act passed, you had voter registration rates 50, 60% in the Deep South. I mean, it was a phenomenally successful piece of legislation. And black voting trends, turnout rates, registration rates have continued in the right direction for decades. In 2008 and 2012, black voter turnout was higher than white voter turnout in this country. Black voter turnout rates were higher than white voter turnout rates. In 2020, blacks voted at higher rates than whites in Maryland, in Missouri, in Mississippi, in Tennessee. I remember Stacey Abrams became the face of voter suppression, starts this organization after she loses the governor's race in Georgia about fighting voter suppression. In Georgia, when she started that organization in 2018, black voter registration and turnout in her state was higher than white voter registration and turnout in her state. I mean, it was a solution in search of a problem. So, again, the left is pretending, and that is why we're having this fight over the Voting Rights Act. The black franchise is not in jeopardy. No one is going after the black franchise. What people want to do, rightfully, I believe, is update the Voting Rights Act to reflect the reality today. Many of these provisions that were put in place, like racially gerrymandered districts or like what they call pre-clearances, when a state has to go to the federal government and ask permission before they change any voting procedures in their states, all of that is no longer necessary because we've made progress. This is good news. And there are people who want to update those provisions, and the left is fighting this because they like to use these provisions to pretend it's still 1964 and that we still need things like racially gerrymandered voting districts. I mean, think about this. This idea is based on the supposedly that whites won't vote for a black candidate. We've elected a black president twice in a majority white country. Yet they want to keep this provision in place. It's also based on, I think, the sort of condescending view that all blacks have the same political interests, whether you're rural, whether you're urban, whether you're rich, whether you're poor. You don't care. You just need a black face in Congress representing you. Also, I would add that most of the Congressional Black Caucus represents districts that are not majority black, which again gets at this idea that whites won't vote for someone black. So, yes, I think these are outdated provisions. I hope the Supreme Court does away with them so that we can update the Voting Rights Act to reflect the reality today. I think they will. They will do that, but that's why this is being fought. And I also want to make one last point, which is to separate this from gerrymandering and map drawing in general. You're never going to get the politics out of that.
Nope.
And I am not in favor of all this mid-decade redistricting that's going on right now, this tit for tat, whether it's New York, California, Texas, or what have you. That needs to stop. I want the Supreme Court to do something about that as well. But the least they can do is get the race factor out of this process.
One other aspect, since you talk about voter suppression, just think about the fact, Jason, that 4 years ago, the All-Star Game was not held in Atlanta, but was moved to Denver because the argument was that requiring African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and others to show a voter ID would be actually voter suppression, and those restrictions in the state of Georgia were enough to move the All-Star game. And I think it illustrates again the need for your book, because this was just 4 years ago in which we had those kind of arguments being made, which now I think some common sense is starting to break out all over the country.
Yeah, the left really wants to keep racial controversies front and center in our conversations, even when they don't belong there. They don't want us to move past race. They don't want to be post-racial. They don't want to be colorblind. They think these issues help them politically, keeping blacks angry and paranoid. It's how some politicians win votes. It's how activists raise money. And so they want us out there fighting over racial issues. And I think a lot of the country wants to move on. But unfortunately, one of our major parties thinks they get a lot of political mileage out of these racial controversies.
Let me just mention that, first of all, we have a link to jasonrileyonline.com. There's a place where if you would like to get some of his other books or even this one, you can get that. There's a contact point if you'd like to have him come and speak, and certainly we have posted many of his articles. But one of the reasons you wrote this is to actually move to a point where we, as you point out, maybe move past the affirmative action era and move into one where we really do come to the idea of evaluating people on the basis of their character, on the basis of their merit, and not on the basis of their skin color. And it does seem to me that the vestiges of that are being removed by the Trump administration, and as you just pointed out, may be removed by the Supreme Court. So that's why you wrote the book, and I certainly thank you for writing it and giving us some time today to talk about it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
We're going to encourage you to find some great material here. First of all, we do have a link to his website, which I think you would find very helpful. Just a minute ago, I mentioned some of his pieces that appear on the Wall Street Journal, so we have that there as well. But this we thought was very important because you're still finding a lot of people that say we are dealing with white supremacy, or there's some that fit there, of course. Systemic racism, harder and harder to find, insists that we not only needed affirmative action, but we even need DEI initiatives. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, these sound good. Affirmative action. Certainly, I want to be affirming individuals. Certainly, I believe in diversity and I want to include people. But as he points out very early on in the book, it is moved from this idea of equal opportunity to equal outcome, as well as from equal treatment to special treatment. And so if you're not familiar with some of the writings of Jason Riley, you can certainly find them, certainly in the Wall Street Journal. You can also find many of his books. And, of course, this one, The Affirmative Action Myth, is certainly one that I would encourage you to get a copy of. Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed, as well as a couple of others. He's done actually 2 biographies on Thomas Sowell, the most recent one, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, and all sorts of other resources that are available. If you'd like to know more, of course, you can find him at the website pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that we, of course, have posted my commentary. We have a take action item. We have a video. Lots of great resources that are available to you on the website pointofview.net. And if you believe that this is a program that needs to continue, you might even click on that button that says donate now and support this organization as well. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.
Thanks so much for listening to today's Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McCarter, host of the Know Why podcast, a weekly podcast for young adults who want to know why they believe what they believe. If you have young adults in your life who would like more meaningful conversations like this, send them over to knowwhypodcast.com. And we'll see you next time on Point of View Highlights.